Well, as we read just a few minutes ago from our passage in 1 John chapter 4, I just want to point out a few observations, just kind of show you a few things there in that passage as we kind of get started here this morning. So there in verse 7 of chapter 4, where John says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him." You see, in those few short sentences, just those couple of verses, God pretty much gives us the entire gospel story. And in fact, a whole lot of other stories are just under the surface in these few verses. Because as he says there in verse 10, this is love. Here's the definition. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Because love comes from God. It's not the other way around. We don't come up with an idea of love and then put that on God. No, God defines love for us. And that's how John starts his passage off. And then, jump to a couple of the verses here with me. Verse 16, "And so we know and rely on the love God has for us." Because of what God has done, we know what love is now. We can define it because of God and who he is and how he's shown it to us. But we have to rely on that love. It's actually the Greek word for like believe in, trust in. You put your weight on this love. This is what you hold on to. And then in verse 19, we love because he first loved us. If there is sort of a key verse that would sum up pretty much all of chapter 4, I'd say it's chapter 4, verse 19. We love because he first loved us. And that's a great way to understand love and how we're going to talk about this. Now, of course, in this chapter, John also, he's got some warnings in there. He talks about some things about loving one another in the Holy Spirit, which we've talked about before. We've read in some of the earlier passages, because John has a way of, he just kind of keeps circling back around to the same ideas over and over again, because he really wants us to understand it. He really wants to connect all the dots. And so he kind of loops back around to that. He gives us some challenges and some warnings, and like a couple weeks ago, Rodney preached a great sermon where he kind of covered that warning in John about loving one another and how important it is. So if you didn't hear it, you should jump back online and make sure you watch that, because that same kind of warning happens in this part of chapter 4 as well. So here's the deal with this passage. Now, we could spend time this morning, and trust me, I could get out a whiteboard. We could go verse by verse, word by word. We could parse some Greek. We could do some sentence analysis. We could do some diagramming. We could do some historical context. We could do all kinds of the heavy exegetical work, and some of you would love that and just be thrilled to do it. And we have a grand old time doing that, and I give you a little study guide at the end. We could take a test later in the week if you really wanted. I mean, we could treat this just like every day when I was in Bible college. We could dissect the thing, go through it forwards and backwards, upside down. We could do it all. But I don't know if that's exactly what the Holy Spirit has in mind for us today, to get all the words and the context and all of that quite. Because I think the Holy Spirit in this passage and what John's trying to get at is, he's not trying to change your mind, he's trying to change your heart. And knowing the definition of a Greek word is helpful. Getting to your head, that's helpful. But I think John has a way in which he's trying to get really more to our hearts. And one great way that John gets to our hearts is with stories. And as we kind of finish up this Around the Campfire series, one of the kind of the last things you do around a campfire, especially at church camp before you all go off to bed, is story time. Or maybe it's Christian camp, it's Devo time. And somebody gets out their Bible and they've got a little story, or they tell you something. And so as we kind of wrap up this Around the Campfire series and we talk about God's love, I just want to tell you some stories of God's love. Because John's not really talking about, just romantic Hallmark movie love where, where girl moves back to small town Montana from New York, and there just happens to be this carpenter in town, and he was such a nerd when they were in middle school, but darn it, now he must have a professional, like, gym trainer or something off camera we never meet, because now he's in great shape, and he has a puppy, and she falls madly in love before Christmas time, and it's, we're not talking about that kind of love. We're talking about the kind of love that serves people. We're talking about the kind of love that gets down in the dirt with people, that isn't afraid to get beat up and sweaty and spill some blood. We're talking about a kind of love that says, I respect you, I value you, just because of who you are, just because you're made by God. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to earn that love. You don't have to, have a way with words or look really attractive or have some kind of special talent. This is just the kind of love that it's just there because God made you and it's there. So here's some stories that I think John had in his mind as he wrote these verses. So story number 1. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful garden, perfect in every way. Every kind of plant, vegetable, fruit you could imagine grew in this garden. Every kind of animal lived in the garden. But it was so much better than the garden you have at home because everything always grew to its full size, and it was nice and ripe. You never had those ugly little bruised spots or rotten spots in your fruit and vegetable garden. You didn't have to worry about the rabbits sneaking in and destroying everything because everything grew just as it was supposed to. And all the animals got along. It was the weirdest thing. A lion and a lamb would just lay down right next to each other. In fact, it was the best kind of petting zoo. You didn't need cages, you didn't need leashes, you didn't need electric fences, you didn't need to worry about lions and tigers and bears because they actually would play a friendly game of tag with you if you wanted. There were no thorns to poke you, no poisonous plants to worry about eating. Everything was just as it was supposed to be. Everything was good. And what made it better than good was every evening, after you had done your work in the garden that day, your father would come down and take a walk with you. And you would talk about the day, you would talk about what you did, he would talk about what he did, he would admire your work, he would compliment you, he'd ask you questions, you would ask him questions about this world he had made. And just as the sun finally began to set, you would crawl into bed, peaceful and content, tell your father good night, and go off to sleep. Life was better than good. It was great. One day, as you were walking along in the garden, you passed by the middle of the garden, which had a tree. Now, your father, he warned you about that tree. That's the only tree you don't eat from, no matter what. Because if you do, you would die. But as you walk by this tree, you hear a little whisper. That fruit looks so good, doesn't it? Wouldn't you like a bite? I could go up there and get you a piece of the fruit. And you look around for this voice, not sure quite where it's coming from yet. And you're like, no way. I would never do that. My father told me not to eat from this tree. Besides, I can eat from anything else. I'm content. I'm good. I don't need it. Well, it does look pretty good, doesn't it? I think you're missing out. I think there's something about this tree you just don't understand. And finally, you see where this voice is coming from. It's from this animal. You know he's in the garden, but you don't see him very often. He doesn't really spend time in the evening with you and your father. He doesn't play with all the other animals. He just kind of keeps to himself. And he kind of comes out of the shadows of this tree and says, well, why wouldn't you want to eat from this? Well, my father said, if I eat this, I'm going to die. I don't want that. He says, die? No, he didn't mean that. He told you that because he's scared of you. He doesn't want you to be like him. Come on. If you eat this, you'll actually be just like your father. Wouldn't that be great? And then you would be equal with him. You wouldn't have to worry about learning so much from him. You think of how proud he'd be if you were just like him. Don't you want to bite? And those words begin to kind of kick around in your mind a little bit, stir around in your heart, and you think, well, maybe a bite can't hurt. That kind of speed things up a little bit after all. Okay, all right, I'll take a bite. And so this animal, he hands you this fruit that just looks so good. You've got this hunger and this thirst, and this piece of fruit seems perfect to satisfy that hunger and that thirst. And so you take a bite, and that first bite, it's so good. This is the best thing you've ever had before in your life. And as you chew, it's the flavors you've never had before, you can't describe. But as you begin to swallow it, something happens. You kind of choke a little and gag as it goes down. You kind of cough a little bit. It's hard to get down. And suddenly it doesn't taste so good. Now it's sour, it's bitter, it starts to hurt your stomach. You feel like you need to throw up, but you can't. And all of a sudden, you feel things you've never felt before. And life doesn't seem so good now. You don't know what to call these feelings, but you so wish you could give them back. And all you can do is run and hide. And the last thing you want is to see your father in the evening. You've never felt this way before, but for some reason, everything in you is screaming that you can't trust him, you can't spend time with him, something bad is going to happen. And as the sun sets, your dread grows, and finally, you hear him walking around in the garden, and you hear his voice call out, "Son, daughter, where are you?" And finally, you make your way to him, and his face is downcast, because he already knows what's happened, as do you. You ate the fruit, didn't you? Yeah, I did. And everything changed. The fruit didn't look as good anymore in the garden. Now there were thorns, now there was poison. The animals backed away from you in fear. And God only had one choice. You can't stay in this garden anymore. So he sent you out. And as he watched you go away, he knew he had to do something about this. So he came up with a plan right then and there. He was going to get you back. He was going to get you back to that garden somehow, some way. But he knew the only way to do that is someone's got to pay the price for eating that fruit off that tree. So he knew, one day I'll come back, and I'll die for you, and I'll get you back here. The moral of the story is, God loved us before we could do anything worthy of love. Before we could earn his love, he loved us, he had a plan for us. While we were still sinners, God loved us. That's part of why John writes these verses, because he's thinking back on that story, and he knows before we could do anything, God loved us. We love because he first loved us. It's not because of what we did, it's because of what he did. You see, our version of love sometimes is kind of like the ATM at the bank, where if you haven't deposited enough, you really can't get out what you want. And some of us act like, well, I'll love you, but you've got to make some deposits first. You want me to respect you? You want me to talk to you a certain way? You want me to treat you a certain way? You want me to serve you? Well, then you better make some deposits. You better serve me. You better talk to me a certain way. You better treat me the way I really think I should be treated. And if you make some deposits, then I'll serve you. Then I'll love you. Then you can make some withdrawals from the ATM. But God's not that way with his love. And we're not supposed to be that way with our love. Because sometimes we do have that feeling like, oh, my tank's kind of full, my energy's running out. I don't know if I can keep doing this. And that's why John says, well, love comes from God. So you know what you do when you don't feel like serving people? You don't look to everybody else to make deposits. You look to God. You say, hey, God, I need some help. I'm tired. I'm worn out. This person is stressing me out. They're getting on my last nerve. They're making me angry. But I know I need to love them. I know I've got to serve them the way you would. So can you help me? And just like in the evening of those gardens, God will say, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to help fill up that ATM that you have so that you can keep loving and serving. So love comes from God. He loved us before we could do anything to earn it or deserve it. Story number 2. It was Passover night. A couple of the disciples had just secured an upstairs room in Jerusalem to celebrate together. Everyone was so busy discussing some very, very important issues and some debates about how they thought they ranked and who got to do what. We didn't even notice. We didn't even notice when Jesus did something that kind of just shocked us. And as we were talking and arguing, slowly our voices faded as we kind of got each other's attention and pointed. And we noticed that Jesus had taken off his coat and he had put a towel around his waist and he went and grabbed the water bowl left for the house slaves. Now, he's not supposed to do that at all. And we were a little bit confused and struck by this. And slowly Jesus began to make his way around the table where we were sitting. And one by one, he started washing all of our feet. This awkward silence filled the room. We all felt very, very uncomfortable. I mean, after all, Jesus was not supposed to do this. A household servant was supposed to do this. A slave was supposed to do this. Maybe even one of us should have been doing this. But none of us had. We were a little too preoccupied, a little too busy. And so Jesus slowly made his way around the table, one by one, washing our feet. Finally, he got to Peter. And of course, Peter, you know Peter, he's always got something to say, and he always gets himself in trouble. So he starts to argue, Jesus, no, you can't wash my feet. You're not washing my feet. And Jesus said something to him about, you got to take a bath and all this other stuff. And so Peter quickly changed his mind. Well, then Lord, give me the entire bath. Wash all of me. And Jesus made some lesson. I'm still trying to figure it out. Something about we just need to have our feet washed because we're already clean. And so Peter, as he normally does, he says way too much, way too fast, and then gets really quiet, kind of looks at the floor, and Jesus finished washing his feet, which, to be honest, I think we're the worst of all of us. But then Jesus came over to me, and I couldn't help but keep watching what he was doing, and as I looked into his eyes, I wasn't quite sure what this was all about. What exactly was he up to? And a part of me wanted to look away, but the rest of me really couldn't. So I just kept watching him as he washed his feet. It felt so strange as he got that dirt and sand rubbed off and washed away. And then he moved on to the next person, and I couldn't help but just keep watching what he had to do. I was surprised, I was intrigued, I was curious. Why would he do this? He could have asked any of us to do it. I should have done it. And finally, he got to the last one of us and finished, and he took that towel off his waist and threw it over his shoulder and said, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. That's what you should do. And at that night, I didn't quite know what he meant. I didn't quite get it. I thought maybe, next time we're in a house, I should be the first one to go grab that water bowl and start washing everybody's feet. But it wasn't until the next day that I realized what he really meant. There I was, Friday afternoon, standing at a place I never thought I'd be standing. And just a few feet above me was the man who was just a few hours ago washing my feet. But he was in pain. He was on a cross. He shouldn't have been up there. He didn't do anything wrong, but it happened so quickly. One minute we were in the garden, and the next he was on trial and then moved to another house and taken before the governor, and we didn't have any time to get a witness together or do it or counter or anything. We were so scared we went and hid. Why did we hide? But here I am as he says, John, can you take care of my mom, please? I won't be here anymore for her. I'm going to that place that you can't follow. That's my king, the one who's willing to carry a towel before he cares about his title. That's the kind of king I want to follow. So yes, of course, I'll take care of your mom. And I'll do far more than that. The moral of the story is, God loved us by sacrificing all he had. And that's why John writes, we love because he first loved us. Love comes from God. How do we know what love is? Well, it's because Jesus Christ came to earth and died on the cross for all of us. That's how we know what love is. We love because he first loved us. Third story. Now Peter couldn't believe he was here. Just a few days ago, Peter sat in his house, the door locked, the windows pulled shut. Every footstep outside of that small gravel road by his house just raised his anxiety. Could that be the Romans? Have they found out where I live? Did they connect me to Jesus? Did they figure out I was there that night? After 3 years of living his life following Jesus, his home seemed familiar and yet strange. His wife did what she could to reassure Peter that he was safe at home, everything was okay. The last 3 years hadn't been a waste at all. But Peter still had so many questions. Why did this happen? Where was he? What was going on? Did we get this all wrong? That night, he decided he needed to go fishing. They needed to make some money. He's just sitting around. And there's nothing like just a good night of hard work to maybe clear his mind out on the calm sea. So he gathered up his friends, and they got the boats ready and the nets, and off they went to fish. It had been a while since they fished last, but it came back pretty naturally. And yet, they didn't catch a whole lot. Not a real successful night. So as the sun began to rise with only a few fish and baskets on their boat, they figured, time to call it, go back home, get some rest. When they heard a voice echo across the water from the shoreline, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat." Now Peter, he could have swore he knew that voice. Maybe somebody from the market. And they were too tired, and the night had been just too rough, so they just figured, okay, well, we're not even going to argue with the guy. We're just going to throw it over. So they throw the net on the right side, and almost immediately, the boat begins to tilt to that side as the net begins to fill with fish. And Peter can't help but think, there's only one other time I've seen that many fish in a fishing net. And before Peter can say what's already in his mind, John beats him to the punch. Peter, that's him. And before the rest of the disciples know what's happened, Peter has stripped down to his underwear, dived overboard, and begins swimming as fast as he can to shore. Because Peter, just like he talks too fast, he also figured, I can swim back to shore before this boat can. And so Peter, as soon as he hits the sand, he's up and he's staring in the face of his Lord. There he is. Peter doesn't really have time now for all those questions and all those worries, because here he is. He can't believe he's here. So there they are, sitting on the beach around a campfire. Jesus is cooking the fish they caught just for them, making them a little breakfast. Jesus stood up after a couple bites of fish and motioned for Peter to follow him, and they walked slowly down the edge of the shoreline there as the sun continued to drift and head towards the evening. And Peter's heart began to beat really fast. Last time he saw Jesus, it was that night outside of the high priest's house, and Peter caught Jesus' gaze through an open window just after he said, "I swear I don't know him." And Peter was afraid, maybe Jesus is going to have some really angry words for me right now. Maybe I'm going to get it. Maybe this is it. But instead, Jesus just had a question for him. "Peter, do you love me?" "Well, yeah, Lord, of course. You know I love you." Peter was so eager to kind of erase, cover up that night. Let's just move on. Let's forget about it. So Jesus asked again, "Peter, do you love me?" "Well, of course. You know I love you, Jesus. Why would you even ask that?" "Peter, do you love me?" "Jesus, yes. You know I love you. Absolutely." "Then feed my sheep." "Sheep? Sheep at a time like this? I'm a fisherman. I'm not a shepherd. Sheep? Jesus, what? How could we talk about sheep at a time like this? Where have you been? Don't you have anything to say about that night?" But as Peter looked into Jesus' eyes, all he could see was forgiveness. And he realized Jesus has already forgotten that night. It didn't matter anymore. Peter had been forgiven before Jesus ever showed up on that shoreline that morning. The moral of the story is, God loved us to drive away our fear. Because when you have God's love in you, there's no room left for fear. We don't operate on fear anymore. We operate on love. And so I think John's thinking about that day on the beach and that night in the upper room and that story he heard growing up in synagogue every weekend. And he knew love just doesn't look like the world. Love is so different. It's just so different. Because the rest of the world wants to say, well, you love me, and then maybe I'll love you. But John knew, oh no, it's so different. We love because he first loved us. So I have one more story for you, but it's not a story from the Bible. It's not a story that was in John's mind as he wrote these words. Now, this is a story that was influenced by what John had to say. So you may have heard of a man named Dr. McQuilkin. And Dr. McQuilkin, back in the 80s, was the president of Columbia Bible College and Seminary. That is until he had to step down. See, in the early 80s, his wife Muriel began to show signs of memory loss. And slowly, her daily activities began to decrease and decrease. She couldn't quite help out at the college like she used to. She couldn't get on her radio program like she used to. She started to slip and forget little things at first and then bigger things. And finally, in the mid-80s, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And a lot of Dr. McQuilkin's friends and colleagues encouraged him that, hey, the only option is you've got to put Muriel in some kind of a nursing home or assisted care center. You've got this important job to do as president of this Bible college. You're an incredible leader. We need you here. He thought about that. He also thought about maybe working a few less hours so he could maybe be at home a little more and they could have maybe a live-in nurse or something to figure out the arrangements. But he just knew he couldn't do that. So he chose to resign. So I'm going to let you hear it from his own mouth instead. Listen to this.
I haven't in my life experienced easy decision-making on major decisions, but one of the simplest and clearest decisions I've had to make is this one, because circumstances dictated it. Muriel, now, in the last couple of months, seems to be almost happy when with me, and almost never happy when not with me. In fact, she seems to feel trapped, becomes very fearful, sometimes almost terror, and when she can't get to me, there can be anger, she's in distress. But when I'm with her, she's happy and contented. And so I must be with her at all times. And you see, it's not only that I promised in sickness and in health, till death do us part, and I'm a man of my word. But as I have said, I don't know with this group, but I have said publicly, it's the only fair thing. She sacrificed for me for 40 years to make my life possible. So, if I cared for her for 40 years, I'd still be in debt. However, there's much more. It's not that I have to, it's that I get to. I love her very dearly, and you can tell it's not easy to talk about. She's a delight. It's a great honor to care for such a wonderful person.
Why would anybody do something like that? Well, I think it's because Dr. McQuilkin knew these words. We love because he first loved us. So the only thing that made sense for him to do is live out the gospel, give up his job, and take care of his wife full time. And so that's what he did. We love because he first loved us. Because see, if it was up to us, probably most times our love would come with some kind of a catch. There'd be a string attached. We'd withhold love until we get what we want. Because our version of love is not very good. We really need God's definition. Otherwise, we kind of withhold love until we get what we want. We manipulate people to get what we want. And that's just not the way God's love works. So here's what I want you to take home with you today. Is chapter 4, verse 19. We love because he first loved us. And that might sound easy, but I'm sure as you know, it can be pretty hard. Because what I'm asking you to do, and what I think John's calling us to do, is you love people without limits. You love people without boundaries. You love people without strings attached, without conditions. You just keep loving people no matter what. You get over whatever it is that makes you withhold your love. Whatever it is that's between you and somebody else, you overcome that so you can love and serve each other. Because what I think John is reflecting on, what Jesus is teaching for us is simply this, that we're going to be a church that loves everybody all the time, any way we can. We're never going to have some sort of rules or hoops you got to jump through to get God's love or to get our love. We're not going to be like a country club where you've got to have a membership and you've got to earn your way in and you've got some rules you've got to follow and then you'll get God's love. No, 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 no. We're going to give God's love freely and abundantly to anybody all the time. That's what John's reflecting on, and that's what he's calling us to. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Here's what I'm asking all of us to do because of this passage. I want you to think right now about that person that you're not on such good terms with right now. Maybe they haven't talked to you in a while. Maybe you really disagreed over the whole COVID thing and what we should do or shouldn't do or how real it is. Maybe it's just you said some hurtful words or they said some hurtful words to you and you just, you kind of avoid them. You avoid them in Kroger. You don't really want to talk to them. You don't want to be around them. And if you do, you just, hey, see you later. Get out of the way. And what I want you to do is this week, I want you to serve them. I want you to think of how you can wash their feet. Don't worry, you don't have to actually wash their feet. Some of you might think that would actually be easier, but what I'm asking you to do is show up and mow their yard this week. Help them with a project around the house. Maybe invite them out to lunch. Take them to coffee. Maybe you need to write them an encouraging note or a letter. Maybe you actually need to apologize. Or even you need to tell them, hey, I miss when we were friends. What happened? Can we figure that out? Can we talk sometime? Maybe that's just what you need to do. And I think if you challenge yourself to do that this week, to serve that person that you're not so fond of right now, even if you have to grit your teeth while you do it and force a smile, I think you should do that and just see what the Holy Spirit does to your heart. So here's what I'm saying. If I can be any more clear, here it is. I want you to stop just saying you love God and show people you love God. Because that's what John says in this passage. If you claim you love God, but you can't love each other, you're a liar. Because if you really love God, if you really have a relationship with Jesus, this is the kind of love that should pour right out of you. Because you know how much you've been forgiven, better than anybody else. And that experience of God's love and forgiveness should only fuel us to love everybody else because of what we've been given. So this week, that's the challenge. Can you do that? See what the Holy Spirit does with your heart when you love and serve others with no strings attached, with no conditions, with no rules. Just, all right, I'm going to do what Jesus did for us. We love because he first loved us. And if you're watching us online, I'd love for you to do that too, whether you're here in Campbellsville or somewhere else. I'd love you to do it. And even, hey, send us a story of maybe what happens. Maybe later this week, send us a comment, send us a Facebook message, Instagram post, whatever it is, and just tell us what happened. Who knows? Who knows what God can do when we love like Jesus?